In both our readings today, we hear about prophets foretelling the future. We hear of Isaiah in the first reading and of Jesus in the gospel reading. In the first reading, Isaiah is assuring the king of Judah that he had no reason to be worried about the threats of invasion from the north, from the joint forces of Samaria and Damascus. Instead, he predicts their looming destruction, which actually took place in Samaria in the year 722 BC, the fall of the North Kingdom under the Assyrian Empire. In the Gospel, Jesus is proclaiming an oracle of judgment, also predicting doom and destruction for the cities of Chorazin and Bethsaida. Is it really possible for people to know the future? You know, some people are willing to pay a fortune just to be able to know what lies ahead of them. Sometimes they seek the services of fortune tellers who interpret the lines on the palm of their hands or use tarot cards in order to answer their questions about the future. Is this the man that I am destined to marry? Some women ask a fortune teller. Will this business venture be successful for me? Or does my son have a future in politics? This is also a favorite storyline for fantasy movies. You would surely be familiar with science fiction movies about people in the present doing a time travel in the past and having the advantage of knowing the future. An example would be Back to the Future, which became so popular, it was even followed by 2 sequels. Recently, there was also this Japanese movie about a boy who could foretell a disaster before it actually happened. He would walk in the street and suddenly encounter people in the opposite direction, walking around with white faces, looking like walking cadavers. Usually, the encounter would be followed by an accident that would happen only a few minutes later. And the person whom he had seen with the white face a while ago would be one of the victims or casualties. In short, he had this rare ability of seeing the future. At some point, he would realize he could still do something to save them, like push them to a sidewalk if they were about to be run over by a car. Now, question, is this the kind of work that the biblical prophets were involved in? Fortune telling? Was their job to foretell the future? Sorry, I hate to disappoint you. The answer is no. This is what I call the most common misunderstanding about the role of a prophet. Even in Tagalog, we have this erroneous idea about the job of a prophet. Ask people what they understand by the word propeta, and they would say manghuhula or a fortune teller. Actually, the biblical prophets were more interested in the present than in the future. They regarded themselves only as messengers. Their main job was to tell people nothing except what God wanted them to know about His predicament over the existing state of affairs. Sometimes the prophets gave angry oracles, predicting doom and judgment, denouncing oppression and injustice in society. But at other times, they pronounced oracles of hope and consolation. They always based their preachings on their recollections of history, of how God had dealt with Israel in the past. They provided a kind of moral compass, giving warnings to the kings and the leaders, or even the people in general, about the disaster that laid ahead of them if they carried on with their corrupt ways. They dared to say frankly what was in store for them if they ignored their prophetic warnings. No doubt, their pronouncements about the present had implications about the future. For most of them, it wasn't even anything supernatural, you know. It could be sheer common sense. Come to think of it, do I have to be a fortune teller to be able to predict the future for a person who has developed the bad habit of chain-smoking cigarettes that he can develop a lung cancer? Or if I say that a person who binges regularly on very unhealthy, high-fat and high-sodium diets is bound to suffer from heart disease? Is a doctor playing the role of a fortune teller if he tells you that? No, that's not foretelling the future. It's common sense. It is an objective critique of your behavior in the present that somehow enables one to project into your future. I think the closer equivalence of the biblical prophets in the modern times would be the honest-to-goodness historians or sociologists or political analysts who write regular opinion columns in the newspapers. On the basis of their reading of the present situation and the socio-political developments, they are able to project some scenarios in the future. They render for society the important service of acting like guardians of the people's collective memory, or as portents of the things to come. Of course, even in biblical times, there were also the equivalents of modern-day trolls, paid propagandists, and shameless political opportunists who do not care at all about the future of the country. They care only about their political career. In the biblical times, these were the ones who were called false prophets. There could also be some religious leaders among them, people with calloused consciences, who do not really care to know what God's will is with regard to the current state of affairs. In the biblical times, these were usually the prophets who were in the payroll of the king, who tended to proclaim only what was pleasing to the powers that be. When prophetic voices are suppressed, God, will always find a way of communicating His word. Do not forget that in the book of Numbers, God even spoke to Balaam through the mouth of a donkey. And in the book of Daniel, we're told that God's finger appeared on the wall, writing a message to warn the king that his abusive days were numbered. Mene tekel pares. In that interesting passage, we hear about God writing an angry message, the way modern activists would write political graffiti on walls. I remember in my younger days, during the first quarter storm, That song by Simon and Garfunkel, entitled The Sound of Silence. The song says, "And the words of the prophets are written on subway halls and tenement halls, and whispered in the sound of silence." My brothers and sisters, in this time of pandemic, we don't need fortune tellers to tell us what lies ahead of us. We need only to open not just our eyes and our ears, but also our minds and our hearts, to be able to pick up God's signals and promptings through prayer and discernment and collective action. We cannot go on like we've never learned our lessons from the past. We cannot continue to play deaf and dumb to the cries of the poor and to the anguished voices of widows and orphans, if we don't want our country to end up again as a pile of ruins.